continue your studies, and realize that at this very good hour, we are in a tremendous battle, and we need men who will stand and preach the gospel of Jesus. So to this good church and Brother Doherty, I appreciate the kind invitation that you gave me to come and speak. But as I look at the men on this lectureship, I'm reminded of a story of two teams, football teams, who were locked in a very close battle on the field. And this one team that hadn't won any games all year long was 3 points ahead, and there were 3 minutes left. Unfortunately, the first-string quarterback was taken out of the game in the first half due to an injury, and the second-string quarterback also was taken out due to an injury, and that left poor old Fred, who was a third-string quarterback and also served as the water boy. So 3 points ahead and 3 minutes left in the game, the coach grabbed Fred and said, "Now, Fred, I don't want you to try to hand off the ball to anyone, and I certainly don't want you to try to pass the ball. You just take the snap for 3 plays and then punt. Do you understand?" "Well, yes, Coach, I understand." So he went out onto the field. They were on the opposing team's 20-yard line. Fred took the snap. He broke loose and ran to the 50-yard line. The second snap, Fred broke loose and ran to the opposing team's 38-yard line. The third snap, Fred took the ball and ran to the opposing team's 2-yard line. The coach was ecstatic. Old Fred, the water boy, is going to really ice the game for us. Fourth play. What did Fred do? Lined up for the snap to punt the ball. The coach did not believe his eyes, but there was Fred on the 2-yard line. He took the ball and punted it into the stands. The coach came out and said, "Fred, with veins popping in his neck, what in the world were you thinking?" He said, "I was thinking we must have the most stupid coach in the whole game of football." So here I am with all these good men, and you might be wondering why. Well, you need to ask the person who was stupid enough to invite me. But I am happy to be here. I would invite your attention to John 14, where Jesus said very clearly that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. We are living in a world today that places a great deal of emphasis on tolerance and inclusion. And one thing that many people are intolerant of is intolerance and exclusivity. If I can stop and put a footnote as we begin our discussion of the religion of Islam, we need to be aware of what's going on in the larger society in which we live. There is a philosophical shift from what is called modernism to what is now called postmodernism. Postmodernism, unlike modernism, suggests that our society is pluralistic, that truth is not absolute, that it is articulated only within particular communities, that I have no right to say this is a universal truth, this and only this. Therefore, we need to embrace different cultures and their different religions and be tolerant and accepting of those different expressions of religion. And unlike modernism that would say that Christianity is untrue because it is false in various ways, postmodernism would say that Christianity is false precisely because it claims to be universally true. And therefore, texts like John 14 in verse 1 and verse 6 particularly, when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, are met with a considerable amount of chagrin by the postmodernist. Over the years, there has been several shifts from pre-modernism to modernism to postmodernism. And several years ago, a man by the name of Walter Truett Anderson wrote a very helpful book titled "Reality Isn't What It Used to Be." He said if we can take the analogy of an umpire, if we had three umpires representing these different three epistemological eras, and epistemology deals with how we obtain knowledge and how knowledge is established and the nature of that knowledge. Let there be light. If we could take these three umpires as representing a pre-modern mind, a modern mind, and a postmodern mind, the pre-modern umpire would say, I call it like it is. Now let that sink in. In other words, reality is something that is revealed to me, and I simply recognize that for what it is. I call it like it is. And the pre-modern mind recognized the existence of God and the authoritative nature of the biblical text. In fact, all the disciplines like history and geography and science were subservient to the revelation of God within the pages of the Bible. So the pre-modern umpire would say, I call it like it is. The modern mind, however, pushed God from the epistemological center to the periphery and said that we have the reasoning capabilities to determine and discover truth for ourselves. Therefore, the modern umpire would say, I call it like I see it. Do you see the shift? Toward an egocentric approach to truth, where human beings stand at the center of truth. And that has caused a great deal of problems for Christianity since the Enlightenment of the 16 and 1700s. But now, since the 1970s, there has been this decisive move away from the assumptions of modern epistemology toward a postmodern way of thinking. So that the postmodern umpire would say, it ain't nothing till I call it. In the postmodern mind, truth, or rather language, does not describe reality, it constructs reality. So that what you say in any given context becomes reality for you, and that is just as valid as any other articulated reality. And from that approach, then, Christianity is simply one articulated construct of reality that competes with Islam and other world religions. That Christianity does not have the right to claim an absolute, universally applicable truth, but is simply one among many equally valid and competing worldviews. Now, this is at the heart of the political correctness movement in which we presently are engaged. So that language is used in such a way to make things that really are wrong sound okay. We do not speak of homosexuality, for instance, as a sin, but as an alternative lifestyle. Do you see the difference? It's simply an alternative lifestyle. And you place that euphemistic construct on that sin, and it makes it sound okay. It's very interesting. The other day I was trying to do something in our washroom. Brother Abbey, I appreciated your lesson on what women should do and what men should. One thing I shouldn't do is wash clothes. I found that out. Though my wife disagrees, so I was in there trying to wash clothes. And I could not figure out all those buttons and all those things you're supposed to do and how much bleach you're supposed to put in that blue shirt I was trying to wash. And my wife said, "You are so domestically illiterate, it is amazing." That sounded pretty good to me. I thought that was a compliment until I really understood what she was saying. Euphemism is the name of the game today. And it's part of this postmodern shift. But I want to say that when it comes to Christianity, it makes exclusive claims to truth. Jesus said it quite plainly. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now today, and the burden of my subject is the religion of Islam. We are faced at this hour with an increasing number of people who are embracing religions other than Christianity. In fact, our Western society is now being characterized as a post-Christian age. That we no longer can assume that the person walking on the street has some concept of Jesus and the authority that carries in his life or her life. Because there are so many people in our society, particularly in the United States, that are embracing alternative kinds of religion. And we as the members of the body of Christ have to confront people who hold to differing worldviews. And that can be a very difficult task indeed. We need not think, for instance, that Islam is now simply isolated to the Middle East or the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. I remember in 1990 when I was in Byron, Georgia, that is when Saddam Hussein led his military machine into the neighboring and small country of Kuwait. You recall that. And during that period, not only were we subjected to the possibilities of that dreaded military machine of Saddam Hussein, but we also were immersed in a culture that seemed foreign to us. And I remember people asking me, what is this Islam that we are now confronted with through Desert Shield? The terms Ramadan and jihad, what do these things mean? What is the philosophy? What is the worldview of Islam? And we approached that as if that was a religion isolated and we were geographically detached from people who believed in Islam. But the fact of the matter is we no longer have that luxury, if it ever were a luxury. Because Islam is now the fastest growing religion in the world, and in the United States in particular. That is the non-Christian world religion. There are now over 1,100 mosques in our country alone. Some of you are familiar with the World Wide Web. If you were to log in and look for, using some kind of search engine, the term Islam, you would find that on very many of our universities, they have Islamic chapters available for you and organizations. From the larger universities in Texas to the smaller ones in Columbus, Georgia, there will be people who are associated with the Islamic religion. And this is making a great deal of impact, particularly in the black segment of our society. And I won't have time to talk about the difference between the black Muslims and Louis Farrakhan's own peculiar North American style of Islam, which are very different. But nonetheless, there are competing Islamic sects among us that are capturing the attention of our population. And we need to be aware of it. And to assist us in that, I think it would be helpful for us, first of all, to see somewhat of the historical background of Islam. Islam itself is an infinitive of an Arabic word which means submit. So Islam itself literally means to submit. And the emphasis there is to submit to Allah, the God of Islam. Muslim is the present participle of the infinitive Islam, which means one who submits. And we must stop and say that certainly a submission to God is a notable thrust in anyone's life. But we must also stop and realize that the religion of Islam, though it has some similarities to Christianity, is far different. My next lecture, I will talk about the points of tension between Christianity and Islam, and hopefully bring these out in much more clarity for you. But for now, we need to realize that Islam was founded by Muhammad, who was born in around 570 A.D. Muhammad's practically unknown father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was about the age of 6. And so the early orphan Muhammad was reared by his grandfather and his uncle, who were members of the Quraysh tribe. This Arabian clan were the ones responsible for protecting and overseeing the Kaaba, which was the important shrine at Mecca dedicated to the pantheon of the Arabs' deities. According to Islamic tradition, in the walls of the Kaaba at Mecca is implanted the black stone, the sacred black stone that fell from heaven in the time of Adam in the sands of Saudi Arabia. And once again, according to Arabian tradition, when Abraham was on one of his pilgrims toward Mecca, he brought this black stone with his son Ishmael, and they built the Kaaba and embedded this stone within its walls. And the Kaaba became the focal point then of the polytheism of the Arab people. And we need to stop and put a footnote here. Before Muhammad came onto the scene, the Arabian culture was grossly polytheistic. Muhammad, at the age of 40, began to receive revelations from God. At least this is the Arabian tradition. Having married a wealthy widow about 20 years earlier, Khadijah, who placed him in responsibilities over her caravans and were so enchanted by his ability to manage and his responsible action that she married Muhammad, provided him with wealth and success, and encouraged his religious inclinations, so that at the age of 40, she encouraged Muhammad to increasingly withdraw from business affairs and meditate upon life. Often he would spend days in the wilderness. And there it is allegedly that he received some of the first revelations from Allah through the angel Gabriel. Now, the first encounter with this heavenly angel was rather violent. According to Surah 96, verse 1, and Surah is the Arabic word for a chapter, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. When Gabriel first appeared to Muhammad, either by choking Muhammad or some other life-threatening gesture, Gabriel made Muhammad submit. And Gabriel said, "Read in the name of thy Lord who made man from the clots of blood." Muhammad, after experiencing convulsions that sent him in a trance-like state, wondered if he had been possessed by one of the jinn, which is a demon-like being in Islamic theology. Once assured by Khadijah, his wife, and others who knew Muhammad that his revelations were from a divine source, these revelations became more frequent. The revelations then that Muhammad began to receive eventually were collected by his followers and transcribed in the book called the Quran. Now, Muhammad did not receive all these revelations in one setting, but over a period of several years, he allegedly received these revelations from Allah. And though there are Muslim scholars who disagree, the general belief is that Muhammad himself was illiterate. He could neither read nor write. So these teachings were merely oral. His followers then transcribed the teaching, and after his death, they were collected together into the volume called the Quran. Now, the word Quran comes from the Arabic word qira'a, which means to recite or to read. And it's quite closely associated with the Hebrew word qara, which means to call or to speak. And it is consistent, therefore, with the repeated imperative call for Muhammad to recite and to read the words of Allah found throughout the Quran. Interestingly, the Quran consists of about 114 chapters called surahs. And each of these surahs is subdivided into different verses called ayat. And ayat is the Arabic word that means miracle, which is very interesting. Because when people would ask Muhammad for confirmation of his prophetic call, rather than performing a miracle himself, he would appeal to the Quran itself as the ultimate miracle, suggesting that since he was illiterate, that no one of his caliber could have written such a perfect book. Therefore, the Quran itself stands as confirmation of Muhammad's prophetic capacity in Islamic theology. Muhammad became frustrated with the polytheism of his Arabic fellow citizens as he was in the seclusion of the desert. Once he was assured that the divine, or that these revelations were of a divine source, he became more open in his remonstration against polytheism. Now, the problem is that many of the traders in Mecca, where he was first preaching his monotheistic message, they benefited financially from the pilgrimages of others who would come to the great shrine at Mecca, the Kaaba, to worship the various gods there represented. And when you have this fiery preacher denouncing polytheism and calling them to the belief in one God, people naturally began to oppose Muhammad. Because if you start tinkering with an individual's wallet, you are going to find yourself in a very difficult situation. And that's what the monotheistic message of Muhammad did initially at Mecca. Eventually, the hostility that was directed toward Muhammad and his followers became so acute that on July 16, 522 AD, Muhammad and his followers fled from Mecca for their lives to a place called Medina. And there was a change in his reception. At Mecca, he was considered to be an eccentric purveyor of an unpopular and unprofitable religion. But in Mecca, and the Quran bears this change out, Muhammad seems to be more of a statesman, one who was accepted readily as a leader of an identifiable group of increasingly powerful people. Things, therefore, were much better in Mecca. The surahs in the Quran, which are not in chronological order, suggest that when Muhammad was in Mecca, he devoted most of his attention to administrative affairs, that the revelations of God were no longer about condemning polytheism and calling them to the one true God, but were now concerned about ethics and legal matters, which suggested this change of position that Muhammad experienced from Mecca to Medina. But unfortunately, Muhammad's monotheistic message was not as accepted openly by the Jews as Muhammad would have liked, thinking that because he was monotheistic that the Jews would openly embrace him. Muhammad was rather frustrated when the Jews began to reject his message as well. And the reason that the Jews in that area began to reject the message of Muhammad is because they realized that his account of Old Testament events simply were not accurate. They conflicted with their own Hebrew scriptures. Muhammad, for instance, would have Ishmael doing something that Isaac actually did. He would have the wrong place name, the wrong person involved. And so the Jews, latching onto these contradictions, realized that the man was not preaching and teaching what the truth was according to the sacred scriptures, the Bible. Well, this put Muhammad in a very difficult situation. If the Quran actually did come from God, how was he going to explain the contradictions between it and the biblical text? Well, his answer was that the Jews either misinterpreted or manipulated their own scriptures, and therefore the Hebrew scriptures themselves were not accurate, but the Quran was. Well, you can imagine what kind of tension that caused between Muhammad and the Jews. When Muhammad was suggesting that either they are misinterpreting or they have manipulated their own scriptures, that was blasphemy, and a charge that they simply could not put up with. Therefore, they further rejected the teaching of Muhammad, and this heightened the tension between the Muslims and the Jews. But because of the power that Muhammad then had in Medina, he was able to either expel the Jews from the area or massacre them, and hence won the dominant hand in Medina. But because of this tension that rose between him and the Jews, the Quran bears out that Muhammad changed his focus from Jerusalem as the center of the Islamic religion back to Mecca, from which he fled just a few years earlier. But if Mecca was to become the focal point once again of the Islamic religion, then the polytheism of Mecca must first of all be expunged. Therefore, having enlisted the help of several Arabic tribes in that area, he made many armed raids against Mecca. And finally, he was able to return to Mecca in 530 A.D. to recapture Mecca for Islam. He purged it of its polytheism, and there it became the focal point of the Islamic religion, and it remains that today. Now I need to back up just a moment and drive down this point. On July 16, 522 A.D., this flight from Mecca to Medina is a very important historical event in the Islamic religion. It is called the flight, the Hijrah, the flight from Mecca. And it is that particular event that marks the official beginning of the Islamic religion, and it is to that event that all Islamic calendars are calibrated. So that in, say, 530 A.D., that would actually be 8 A.H. in the year of the Hijrah. And that's an important point for us to remember because it figures prominently in the theology of Islam. By his death in 532 A.D., Muhammad was successful in unifying a lot of the Arab tribes in the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam. And that's when he died. Now, when Muhammad died in 532 A.D., that left Islam with a very acute leadership crisis. He left neither an heir nor had he appointed his successor. And the appointing of the caliph, which was the name of the next leader, the title of the leader, caused a great deal of problems in Islam. Within 30 years, 4 caliphs had been elected. The first was Abu Bakr, which was one of the first converts of Muhammad in the city of Mecca and remained his close friend all of his life. He held the caliphate until 634 AD for 2 years. Umar ascended to that position in 634 through 644 AD. And then Uthman took over from 644 to 656 AD. Now we need to stop here and talk about Uthman just a minute. During the regime of Uthman, the Quran itself, as a literary document, underwent the process of standardization. Up until this point, there were various readings of the Quran in different areas. There were chief cities, one at Medina, for instance, there was one at Mecca. And you compare the collection of teachings among these major documents during the period of Uthman, and you notice that they did not correspond fully. There were variant readings. Uthman took it upon himself, therefore, to standardize the Quran so that there would be a one single text that would be standard for Islam. Once he succeeded in bringing together, through the process of literary criticism of sorts, the accepted text, he destroyed all the variant readings. Now, this is important for us today, because one of the arguments that the Muslim will make is that the Quran, unlike the Bible, is not riddled with textual variants. Now, for those of you who have studied Hebrew or Greek, you would realize that our texts have a critical apparatus at the bottom. And that critical apparatus tells us that there are different manuscripts in the Old Testament, for instance, the Septuagint version or the Qumran text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, have different readings. The same is true in the Greek text, with over 5,000 manuscripts behind the accepted version. The Muslim will say your Bible, therefore, is so corrupt that the original intent has been obscured by all of these variants that you recognize to be true. Of course, the state of the biblical text is not in as much disarray as the Muslim would have us to believe, however. Because the fact of the matter is, these variants are very minor in detail as far as doctrinal issues are concerned. Usually, they have reference to the misspelling of a word, a place name, or an individual's name, or a misspelling of a particular word that has not affected the context and the doctrinal element of the text whatsoever. And I can stand before you and say that we can be very confident of the integrity of the biblical text. The manuscripts found at Qumran, for instance, have really buttressed the integrity of the Old Testament text. And we really don't have time to talk about that. The Quran, however, does not have the amount of manuscript evidence backing it up because Uthman destroyed the variants. That does not mean, therefore, that there would be some questionable readings in the text because there are no variants with which to judge. So the argument for the Quran's textual integrity really is based upon faulty reasoning and faulty foundation, once you take into consideration the historical events during the regime of Uthman. But then finally, Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad himself, became the last caliph between the years 656 and 661 AD. Now, this is what has caused the division in Islam. Islam is not a monolithic religion whatsoever. There are primarily two major divisions, the Sunni sect and the Shia sect. The Sunnis believe that the caliph should be appointed by the process known as ijma, or consensus, and that he simply should hail from Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh tribe. His responsibility is not to continue the prophetic legacy, but simply to guard it and to interpret the Quran for the contemporary Islamic community. That is the sole purpose of his responsibility. So taking these four caliphs together with Muhammad himself, the Sunnis believe that the behavior and the interpretation of these four rightfully appointed caliphs form the basis for their life today. So that the Sunni sect, latching on to the Arabic word sunnah, which means behavior, reflects this connection to the four rightfully appointed caliphs. About 90% of Muslims today would belong to the Sunni sect. The other sect, the Shia sect, about 10% of Muslims belong to this more militant sect. They believe that the caliph has more responsibility than simply to guard the prophetic legacy, but that Muhammad passed on his wilayah, his spiritual abilities, through Ali, his son-in-law, which allowed him to interpret the Quran and to guide the Islamic community infallibly. And that each generation from Ali has this wilayah of Muhammad. One of the major divisions within the Shia sect is the Imamis. They view their leader as the Imam. No longer do you have a visible caliph because the 12th Imam is now in occlusion, in a state of hiding. You can't see him. However, the Ayatollahs, the senior experts in the law, have access to the Imam, and that through him they can therefore receive guidance. Eventually, the Imam will return in somewhat of a messianic regime in which Islam will become the world religion, and that's why they are so fanatic at this moment, to purge everything from them except the religion of Islam so the Imam can return. We probably remember Ayatollah Khomeini more than any of the Ayatollahs. He was the one who allegedly had access to the hidden Imam. And finally, there is a movement within Islam called Sufism, which is more of a mystical approach to Islam. This is a movement, not a sect, so that those who would be the Sunni sect or part of the Shia sect would consider themselves Sufis, those who were the mystics, seeking for some experiment or experiential knowledge of God and His love in their lives, becoming so frustrated with a legally oriented stance of Islam, they wanted more of an emotional appeal, and therefore, through various ascetic rituals, they seek to get in touch with Allah. Rather than seeing God as a transcendent God, God is part of nature. And their belief is that once you are fully absolved into Allah, then you will realize that nothing exists except Allah. It's a very pantheistic view of God, and they therefore are considered quite heretical. Now, as I look at the clock, and as I have introduced my lesson for the morning, my time is gone. I would invite you to look at the manuscript to realize that there are various duties and beliefs of Islam. And perhaps we can address that in the next setting. But let me end by saying, it is important for us to go through this excruciatingly boring historical material so that we can at least get a window into the Islamic world, a world that is quite different from Western culture, in which there is a great deal of tension between their belief system and our belief system. And if we, as members of the body of Christ, are going to be successful in bringing the Islamic community or individual Muslims to Jesus, we are going to have to be aware of their theological stances, what they believe, and their particular outlook on life. And I pray that God will give us the wisdom and the ability to do so. But I want to conclude by once again reading John 14:6.